Hello everyone, I know you are going to use this video for falling asleep, so before that, like this video, subscribe to the channel and let me know where you are from. Also, what time is it? The evening sky hung heavy over the town, casting long, creeping shadows over the small, quiet streets. The clock tower struck 6, and in the distance, a soft whisper of wind rustled through the branches of a nearby tree, as if nature itself was holding its breath. It was a strange, oppressive quiet, a kind of silence that demanded attention, that warned you that something was amiss, though you couldn't quite place it. And in that silence, the house waited. The house had been there as long as anyone could remember. It stood at the edge of town, nestled on a quiet hill, where the land sloped down to meet the old cobblestone road. To the casual passerby, it was just another relic from the past, an old Victorian mansion, its once vibrant paint faded and peeling, the windows covered in layers of dust. Yet, for those who paid attention, there was something deeply unsettling about the place. Something that caused a chill to creep up your spine, even on the warmest summer evening. The locals called it the Whistler House, though no one really knew why. Perhaps it was because the wind would whistle eerily through the cracks in its walls at night, or because of the strange rumors that surrounded it. But the rumors were the sort of stories that no one dared speak of out loud, and even fewer dared to believe. The house was a mystery, a thing to be avoided, and most people did their best to steer clear of it. But all that was about to change. It began with a letter. Sarah Monroe, a young woman in her late 20s, had always been curious about the house. Growing up in the town, she'd heard the whispers, felt the discomfort of the townspeople when they spoke of it, and, like many others, had wondered what lay behind its weathered walls. But Sarah wasn't like everyone else. She wasn't content with just the stories. She needed to know the truth. That's why she was standing at the edge of the town, clutching the crumpled envelope in her hand. She had never expected to receive the letter, and even now, the feel of it against her skin sent a strange shiver down her spine. The handwriting on the envelope was neat, but oddly archaic, as though it had been written decades ago. Inside, the message was short, cryptic, and direct. Come. It's time. There was no return address, no clue as to who had sent it. The handwriting seemed familiar, but Sarah couldn't place it. It tugged at the edge of her memory, like a forgotten dream that you could never quite recall. She looked up at the house again, its silhouette dark against the dimming sky. It seemed to loom over her, as if watching her, waiting for her. Her heartbeat quickened, but she felt a pull, a strange compulsion to step forward. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper, something primal that urged her to approach the house. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. She thought of her friends, her family, how they would react if they knew she was even thinking about going inside. They had all warned her. They'd all heard the same stories, the same rumors. It wasn't safe. The house had a long history of tragedy, of people who had entered and never returned, of strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances. No one knew what had happened to the previous owners or why the house had been abandoned for so long. But none of that mattered now. With a steadying breath, Sarah walked toward the house. The gravel path crunched beneath her boots, and the scent of damp earth filled the air. As she drew closer, the house seemed to grow larger, its presence more oppressive. The windows, dark and empty, stared back at her like hollow eyes. A thin mist began to rise from the ground, curling around the base of the house like a cloak, as if the building itself was shrouded in a veil of secrecy. She reached the front door, its wood worn and cracked with age. Her fingers brushed against the brass knocker, which seemed to vibrate under her touch, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Without thinking, she lifted it and let it fall, the sound echoing through the stillness of the evening. There was no answer. For a moment, Sarah stood there, listening. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees. The house felt alive, as if it were breathing with her, drawing in the air around her, responding to her presence. And then, slowly, the door creaked open. At first, she thought it was the wind. But when she looked down, the handle was slowly turning by itself, as though an unseen hand was inviting her in. She took a step back, her heart racing. But then, a voice, soft and clear, drifted on the wind. So faint she wasn't sure if she had heard it at all. "Come inside, Sarah." The voice was familiar, though she couldn't place it. It sent a shudder down her spine, but more than that, it pulled her in. There was a force behind it, something gentle, but persuasive. She felt as though she had no choice. Taking a deep breath, she stepped over the threshold and into the darkened hallway. The door slammed shut behind her with a force that made her jump. She spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, save for the creeping shadows that seemed to shift as if they had a life of their own. The house was silent, dead silent. Her footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors as she walked deeper into the house. The air was cold, and the walls seemed to press in on her. A faint scent of decay lingered in the air, and the faintest flicker of movement at the corner of her eye made her pulse quicken. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. She continued on, her hand brushing against the walls as she moved. The house seemed to stretch on endlessly, its maze of hallways and rooms disorienting and unnerving. The further she walked, the more it felt like the house was shifting around her, its layout changing with every step. And then she heard it, a faint whispering. It started softly, like the rustling of leaves, but gradually grew louder. It wasn't coming from any one direction. It seemed to be everywhere, surrounding her, filling the air. The words were unintelligible, but there was a rhythm to them, a pattern that made her skin crawl. She quickened her pace, her footsteps now frantic. The whispers followed her, growing louder, closer, more urgent. And then, without warning, the hallway in front of her darkened. The air grew thick, suffocating. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked ahead, only to find a door, one she hadn't seen before, standing at the end of the hall. The door was different from the others. Its frame was carved with intricate symbols, runes she didn't recognize, and the wood was stained, as if something had soaked into it over time. The whispers were louder now, and she could feel the weight of them pressing against her ears, as if the house itself was trying to speak to her. Without thinking, Sarah reached for the door, her fingers trembling as they touched the cold, rough surface. And then, the door swung open by itself. What lay beyond was not what she expected. The room was vast, its walls lined with shelves stacked high with ancient books. But what caught her attention was the center of the room. A large, circular mirror stood there, its frame gold and ornate, its surface perfectly still. But there was something wrong with it. The reflection wasn't hers. Instead, it was a dark figure, standing in the center of the room, its face obscured by shadows. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It simply stood there, waiting, her breath caught in her throat. The figure was familiar. She could feel it, deep in her bones. But before she could think any further, the reflection began to change. The figure reached out, its hand touching the surface of the mirror, and in that moment, Sarah felt the pull. The force of it was like gravity, and it yanked her forward, her body moving against her will, pulling her toward the mirror. She tried to resist, to pull away, but it was no use. The mirror's surface seemed to shimmer, then ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. And then, before she could scream, everything went black. The darkness was all encompassing. Sarah couldn't see, couldn't hear, nothing. But she could feel it. The weight of the air around her, the pressure of something close, something watching. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead as she struggled to breathe. And then, As suddenly as it had come, the sensation stopped. She opened her eyes. What she saw was not the mirror, nor was it the room she had been standing in. The walls around her were bare, the air thin and stale. A low hum filled the room, vibrating in her bones. And then she heard it, a voice, soft and cold. "It's not over yet, Sarah." Sarah's eyes shot open, but the blackness around her remained impenetrable. Her breath came in shallow, panicked bursts, and her heart thudded loudly in her chest, echoing in the suffocating silence. The weight of the air was thick, pressing down on her as though the very atmosphere was intent on holding her in place. Her limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as if they had been bound by invisible forces. She tried to move, but no matter how hard she willed her body to respond, it remained frozen. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to stand, to escape, to run from whatever nightmare she had just entered. But still, the darkness held her captive. For what felt like an eternity, Sarah lay there in the stifling void, unable to comprehend where she was, what was happening. Her mind struggled to make sense of the situation, but every time she grasped at a thought, it slipped away like sand through her fingers. Then she heard it again, the voice. "It's not over yet, Sarah." The voice was impossibly close, as though it were whispered directly into her ear. It was low, distorted, and carried with it an unmistakable sense of malice. The tone was familiar in a way that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, sending an icy chill down her spine. For a brief moment, she thought she could recognize it. There was something about it, something that tugged at her memory, like the distant echo of a dream long forgotten. But before she could focus on the voice any longer, a faint light flickered in the distance, drawing her attention. At first, it was little more than a pinprick in the dark, a soft, dim glow that seemed to shimmer and pulse with an ethereal, unnatural light. But as Sarah strained her eyes, trying to focus, the glow began to grow brighter, and the edges of the darkness began to recede. Slowly, like the rising of a new dawn, the light spread, illuminating the space around her. It revealed a narrow, stone corridor, its walls lined with ancient tapestries that hung crookedly from rusted nails. The air in the corridor was heavy with dust and the unmistakable scent of mildew. But what caught her attention most was the silence. It was absolute. The only sound was the faint echo of her own breathing, the only movement the shifting of the light that now surrounded her. Sarah pushed herself up, her body still feeling unsteady, as though she had just awakened from a long, deep sleep. Her legs wobbled as she stood, her feet sinking slightly into the cold stone floor beneath her. She rubbed her eyes, trying to clear the haze from her vision, and took a tentative step forward. The light followed her, casting long, twisting shadows along the walls. She hesitated, then took another step, and then another. The corridor stretched on endlessly, its end hidden in the shadows. But Sarah felt an undeniable pull, a force urging her forward, deeper into the unknown. She wasn't sure why, but she knew she had to keep moving. As she walked, the air seemed to grow colder. The walls seemed to narrow, the space around her growing tighter, more claustrophobic. Her pulse quickened, but she pushed on, unwilling to turn back. After what felt like hours, the corridor opened up into a large, dimly lit room. At first, Sarah could make out little more than the outlines of large, looming shapes that filled the space. But as her eyes adjusted to the low light, she began to recognize what they were. The room was filled with old, decaying furniture, armchairs draped in dusty, tattered cloths, tables covered in sheets that had long since turned yellow with age. But it wasn't the furniture that caught her attention. It was the mirrors. The room was lined with mirrors. Massive, ornate mirrors whose surfaces gleamed faintly in the dim light. Each one was framed in intricately carved wood, the designs worn and faded with time. But it wasn't the frames that held her gaze. It was the reflections. The mirrors didn't reflect what was in front of them. They reflected something far darker, something far more sinister. Figures moved in the reflections, figures that shouldn't have been there. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She took a step closer to one of the mirrors, her breath catching in her throat as she peered into the glass. The reflection of the room was distorted, warped, as if the mirror itself was trying to bend reality. And standing in the corner of the reflected room was a figure, a dark silhouette, barely visible in the shadows. It was standing perfectly still, its face hidden in the gloom, its body unmoving. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears as she stepped back. Her eyes flicked to another mirror across the room, and she froze in place. The reflection there was different. The same figure stood in the corner, but this time it was closer, much closer. She spun around, heart racing, but the room behind her was empty. There was no one there. The only sounds were her own rapid breathing and the faint hum that seemed to emanate from the walls. The figure in the mirror was gone, but Sarah could still feel its presence. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she backed away, her mind reeling. The mirrors were somehow wrong. They didn't reflect reality, they reflected something else. Something hidden just beneath the surface, something ancient and malevolent. She turned to leave, but as she did, her eyes caught the reflection in another mirror. This one was different. In the reflection standing right in front of her was a figure, a woman. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken deep into her skull. Her hair hung in long, stringy strands, matted with dirt and grime. She was dressed in a tattered gown, the fabric torn and stained with something that looked disturbingly like blood. The woman smiled. The smile was twisted, unnatural, as though it had been painted onto her face with cruel precision. Her lips curled upward, but there was nothing in her eyes. They were dark, empty, hollow, like the eyes of a doll. Sarah stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest, her legs trembling beneath her. The woman in the reflection tilted her head, as if studying her, before reaching out a hand toward the mirror. And then she spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was low, guttural, and rasping, like a whisper from a grave. It sent a wave of ice through Sarah's veins, paralyzing her in place. Before she could react, the reflection of the woman vanished. The mirror returned to its normal, empty state, showing only the dimly lit room behind her. But the air was no longer still. It hummed with energy, with something dark and alive. The whispers that had been echoing in the back of her mind grew louder, more distinct. And now, they weren't whispers at all. They were voices, voices that spoke in unison. Their words a strange chant that filled the room with an unbearable weight. Sarah turned toward the door, her panic rising, her mind screaming for her to escape. But before she could make it to the door, the mirrors began to shake. The glass rippled, distorting, warping as though something was pushing against it from the other side. The air grew thick, heavy with tension, as the room seemed to warp and twist around her. And then the woman's voice returned. "You can never leave." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "You can never leave." The voice was not one, but many, hissing, whispering, murmuring all around her, threading through the very fabric of the room. Sarah's heart pounded wildly, the sound of it reverberating in her ears as her hands trembled at her sides. She had to get out. The mirrors were shaking now, the glass rippling like water, sending wave after wave of distortion across their surfaces. The figures within the mirrors, once still, now shifted, moving in unnatural ways, twisting their limbs as though they were trying to reach through the glass. The woman, the pale, gaunt figure, was gone, but her presence lingered. Sarah stepped back, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The room around her felt too tight, too oppressive. The air pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe, as if the walls themselves were closing in. She turned, her gaze darting to the door at the far end of the room. But before she could make a single move, something stopped her. A shadow, a figure, moved across the far wall, blocking her escape. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, an illusion conjured by her racing mind, but as the shadow grew darker, sharper, it became undeniable. It was tall, its form barely discernible in the dim glow, but Sarah could make out the outline of something monstrous. Its shape was indistinct, shifting, as though it was not entirely solid, as though it was only half formed. Her body went rigid with terror, and she froze in place, her legs refusing to obey her frantic desire to run. The figure stood there for a long moment, still, silent, and Sarah's mind raced to understand what she was seeing. She could feel its gaze on her, cold, unfeeling, and utterly alien. And then it moved. The figure stretched its long, shadowy limbs toward her with an unnatural fluidity, closing the distance between them faster than she could react. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a grotesque distortion of human features. Its skin was stretched tight over its skull, the eyes hollow and void of any discernible emotion. There was no mouth, only a jagged wound where its jaw should have been, dripping with something black and oily. Sarah stumbled backward, her breath coming in frantic gasps, her mind screaming at her to move, to run. But the shadow didn't give her a chance. It reached out, its long fingers brushing her shoulder with a coldness that seemed to freeze her to the core. It whispered in her ear. Its voice was not the same as the woman's, but it carried the same chill, the same weight of inevitability. You shouldn't have come. And now, you never will leave. The words sank into her, pressing down like the weight of the earth itself. It felt as though they were carving themselves into her soul, marking her as something that could never be undone. She tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat, suffocated by the grip the figure had on her. The shadow's fingers tightened, digging into her flesh with unnatural force, pulling her forward, pulling her closer. She tried to break free, to push away, but it was like struggling against an iron vise. The darkness seemed to close in on her from all sides, swallowing up the edges of the room, until there was nothing left but the suffocating presence of the shadow and the oppressive silence that filled the space between them. In a desperate bid for freedom, Sarah did the only thing she could think of. She reached for the mirror closest to her, her hand slamming into the cold glass. The surface of the mirror rippled under her touch, as if reacting to her panic, as if it were alive. And then, without warning, the glass shattered. But it wasn't a normal shattering. The mirror fractured in a slow, deliberate way, as though it were being torn apart from the inside. The pieces didn't fall to the floor. Instead, they seemed to hang suspended in mid-air, swirling around her like shards of glass caught in a windstorm. The shadow recoiled, its form shuddering, its fingers retracting as though the mirrors held some power over it. Sarah, her mind spinning in a whirl of confusion and terror, barely had time to process what was happening before a blinding light erupted from the center of the broken mirror, washing over the entire room. For a moment, the room was nothing but pure light, a blinding, painful brightness that made her eyes water, that made her skin feel like it was being seared from the inside out. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the light vanished. Sarah blinked, her vision swimming as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The room was different now. The oppressive shadows were gone. The walls no longer seemed to press in on her. The air felt lighter, less suffocating. But the change wasn't just in the room, it was in her as well. She could feel it, the shift. Something inside her had changed. It was as though she had crossed an invisible boundary, a line that she could never uncross. The pull, the force that had drawn her into this place, was stronger now. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was her, as if the house had claimed a part of her, infected her with its dark influence. Her hands shook as she stepped back, her mind still reeling from the experience. She could hear the whispers again. Softer now, but still present, still urging her forward. They came from all around her, as though the house itself was alive, feeding on her fear, feeding on her confusion. And then, as though in response to her panic, the walls seemed to change once again. The room, once dimly lit and musty, now appeared to stretch, expanding, elongating as though it were reshaping itself around her. The mirrors, once shattered, had been replaced, standing intact, reflecting an image that made Sarah's blood run cold. The reflection wasn't hers. In the mirror, there was a figure, a man this time, though his face was obscured by shadows. He was dressed in an old, tattered suit, and his hands were bound in chains, each link rusted and coated with a dark, sticky substance that looked disturbingly like blood. His eyes were hollow, empty, as if he had been trapped in that reflection for eternity. And then the figure moved. Slowly, as though waking from a long slumber, it raised its bound hands to the mirror, pressing its palms against the glass. Its eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, locked onto Sarah's, and in that moment, she felt as though her soul was being drawn into the mirror. "You're not alone," the figure whispered, its voice distant and distorted. "We all belong to the house now." Sarah recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to run, wanted to escape. But the whispers grew louder, the figure in the mirror pressing closer. And then, without warning, the chains on the man's wrists snapped. He lunged forward, his body collapsing against the glass with a sickening crack, his face contorting into a grotesque, twisted expression of agony. The mirror shattered, but the figure didn't disappear. Instead, it surged out of the wreckage, its form solidifying as it broke free from the glass. Sarah froze. The figure was no longer just a reflection. It was real, and it was coming for her. The figure loomed over Sarah, its presence overwhelming and suffocating. The air itself seemed to bend under the weight of its form, like the very atmosphere around her had become thick with the energy it emanated. For a split second, she couldn't breathe. The space between her and the figure stretched out into infinity, and her legs locked into place, refusing to move as she stared into the hollow eyes of the man who had once been trapped within the mirror. He was no longer a reflection. He was real. The figure stood tall, his body clad in tattered, dark clothes that clung to his gaunt frame. His face was deathly pale, his skin stretched thin over sharp, angular bones. His eyes, those deep, dark hollows, seemed to pierce through her, as if seeing into her very soul. The chains that had once bound his wrists were now broken, scattered around him like the remnants of a long, forgotten prison. He took a step forward, his movement unnaturally slow, deliberate. Each footfall seemed to echo in the silence, reverberating in Sarah's chest, shaking her to the core. She wanted to run. Her instincts screamed at her to flee, but her body remained frozen, unable to move. "You've seen us now," the man rasped, his voice rough and hollow, like the sound of rocks scraping together in an abandoned cave. "You've crossed the threshold. You cannot undo what has been done." His words sank into her, dragging her down, filling her mind with an unbearable weight. The room around them seemed to shift again, the walls stretching and warping, closing in on them both. The mirrors, now whole again, lined the walls like silent witnesses to a terrible, unspoken truth. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest as the man took another step closer. She could feel the cold of his presence, the chill that radiated from him, like the deep freeze of a forgotten winter. Every instinct within her screamed to get away, but her legs refused to obey. The fear that gripped her was suffocating, choking her thoughts, drowning her in an ocean of uncertainty and terror. And then, with a sickening crack, the man's mouth opened. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and guttural, each word a slow, deliberate punch to her mind. "This place doesn't let go. Once it has you, it never lets you leave." The shadows in the room seemed to pulse with his words, as though they were alive, reacting to his voice. The mirrors, too, seemed to grow darker, more distorted, as if they were slowly consuming the very light of the room. Sarah felt herself being pulled toward them, as if the darkness inside the glass was reaching out, trying to drag her in. Her breath quickened, panic rising in her chest. She shook her head violently, trying to snap herself out of the trance she felt slipping over her mind. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No, I won't stay. I won't let you." The man's hollow eyes fixed on her as he moved even closer, his movements impossibly smooth, as if he were gliding across the floor. His chains clinked softly, but his gaze was unrelenting, as if the very weight of it was enough to pull her apart. "You have no choice," he said, his voice now more forceful, more demanding. "Once you've entered, you belong to it. You belong to the house, and it will not let you leave." Suddenly, the room seemed to shudder, as though it was alive, its very foundations groaning under some unseen pressure. The walls cracked, fissures spider, webbing across the ancient stone, and through the cracks came something far worse than the man in front of her. It was a feeling, a sensation. It was the weight of something old, something ancient. The floor beneath her trembled. The shadows seemed to pull tighter, closer, like a net closing around her. Sarah's skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, being hunted. And then, as if on cue, the air shifted, like a switch had been flipped. The light in the room dimmed, flickering like a dying flame. And then she heard it, the whispers. They were no longer faint, no longer distant. The whispers filled the air now, surrounding her, pressing against her ears like 1,000 voices, each one louder than the last. "Help us," the voices pleaded. "Set us free." The man's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a twisted, cruel smile. He raised his hand, and the darkness seemed to follow his gesture, crawling along the walls, gathering around him like a living thing. "You think you can leave?" he asked, his voice a low hiss. "You think you have control? You never did. You're already part of it?" The mirrors flickered, their surfaces rippling, as if trying to escape their own reflection. The images within them began to warp and shift, figures moving in unnatural ways, contorting their bodies, their faces twisted in agony. They were them. The trapped souls, the ones who had come before Sarah, the ones who had tried, and failed, to escape. One by one, faces emerged from the mirrors, staring out at her with vacant, lifeless eyes. They were all around her now, trapped in the glass. Their forms stretched and deformed, as if they had been caught mid-scream. Some reached toward her, their hands pressed against the surface of the glass, their mouths open in silent pleas for help. Others simply stared at her, their eyes empty, their souls long since consumed by the house. Sarah stumbled back, her mind racing, her heart hammering in her chest as the full weight of what was happening hit her. The house was alive. The house was consuming her. And she had no way out. "You're just like us now," the man whispered, his voice cold and detached. "You're trapped, just as we were, just as we all are." Sarah's eyes locked onto the reflection of one of the figures in the mirror. The face was so familiar, and yet it wasn't. It was her. It was her. The reflection stared back at her, her own face twisted in horror and despair, as if she were already one of them. Already trapped, her soul bound to the house forever. A scream rose in her throat, but it was strangled, choked off by the sheer horror of the realization. She was already part of it. The man took another step forward, and Sarah felt herself drawn toward him, as though an invisible force was pulling her toward the darkness. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, their voices now a cacophony of rage and pain. And then she heard another voice, a voice that was different from the others. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a chant. It was clear. It was strong. Fight. The word echoed in her mind like a command, cutting through the noise. She gasped, her body trembling as she looked around, her eyes darting in every direction, trying to find the source of the voice. Fight! The voice repeated, more urgent this time. It was the voice of someone else. Someone who had been here before. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she realized there was someone else. Someone still fighting. Someone still trying to escape. She wasn't alone. Not yet. The realization hit her like a lightning bolt. There was hope. There was a way out. If only she could find it. Her hands shook as she clenched them into fists, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to fight. She had to fight if she wanted to survive. But the shadows around her pressed in tighter. The figures in the mirrors reaching toward her with skeletal hands, their mouths gaping wide in eternal screams. And the man, the one who had once been a reflection, was no longer just a figure. He was becoming something else. Something more monstrous. She had to act. She had to do something. But what? The whispers, the house. It was all closing in. The shadows surged forward, and then everything went black. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, the darkness around her pressing in, smothering her. Her body felt weightless, suspended in between place where time and space seemed to bend and stretch. She couldn't breathe. Her chest felt heavy, as though an unseen force was pushing down on her. For a brief moment she wondered if she had died. But the pain, the rawness in her chest, told her otherwise. Her heart hammered in her ribcage, the frantic rhythm echoing in her ears. She tried to move, but her limbs were frozen, as though bound in some unseen grip. Her skin felt clammy, cold, as if the temperature of her very being had been drained from her. Sarah. The whisper came from somewhere deep in the blackness. It was faint, distant, but it was there. A voice. A lifeline. Her name, spoken softly, urgently, as if calling her back from some abyss. She tried to respond, but her mouth was dry, unresponsive. She tried to scream, to cry out, but no sound came. The darkness closed in tighter, and then, without warning, it shattered. A sharp, blinding light pierced through the void, slicing through the oppressive blackness. Sarah gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts as her eyes adjusted to the light. She blinked, disoriented, her vision swimming as she tried to focus on her surroundings. The room was gone. The mirrors, the shadows, the figure, all of it had vanished. Instead, she found herself standing in the middle of an entirely different place. It was a long, narrow hallway, its walls lined with old, cracked wallpaper. The floor beneath her feet creaked with every step, and the air was thick with dust and the musty smell of abandonment. The light came from a single overhead bulb, its faint glow casting long, stretching shadows across the floor. It was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Sarah turned in place, her heart still racing, her mind reeling. How had she gotten here? What was this place? It didn't look like the house, at least not the one she had just been in. The walls weren't adorned with the strange symbols, and there were no mirrors. It almost looked like an old house, but something about it felt different, detached from everything that had happened before. And then the whispers started again. They were faint at first, distant echoes that seemed to seep through the walls, creeping into her thoughts. Slowly, the voices grew louder, more insistent. And as they did, Sarah realized with growing horror that they were speaking to her. You're still here. You haven't escaped. You're part of it now. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the voices, but they were inside her head, crawling beneath her skin, their words insistent, like insects burrowing deep into her consciousness. She staggered backward, the light in the hallway flickering violently as if responding to her panic. The walls seemed to close in around her, constricting, pressing her forward. She could feel the weight of it. The pressure of the house, the pull of whatever force had brought her here. You can never leave. The voices chanted, each one distinct, yet part of some unholy chorus. It's too late now. A chill ran down her spine, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her fingers dug into the sides of her head, her nails scraping against her skin as if trying to tear the voices out of her mind. But no matter what she did, they wouldn't stop. They wouldn't let go. Desperately, Sarah forced her legs to move. She stumbled forward, her breath coming in jagged gasps, and she ran down the narrow, claustrophobic hallway, the sounds of the whispers chasing her, closing in on her like a storm. Her feet pounded against the wooden floor, each step echoing louder and louder in the oppressive silence of the hallway. She didn't know where she was going, didn't care. She just needed to get away from the voices. She had to escape. But the hallway stretched on forever. The walls, once distant, seemed to grow closer, narrowing around her with each passing second. The light above her flickered again, and she could feel the air around her thickening, suffocating, as though the house itself was alive, hungry. The voices whispered in unison now, a low hissing sound that filled the hallway, surrounding her, pressing her in. And then she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a door stood ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the crack. It was the only way forward, the only way out, with no other choice. Sarah pushed herself forward, her legs burning with the effort. She could hear the whispers now, louder than ever, rushing at her from every direction. The shadows were following her, creeping along the floor, stretching across the walls like tendrils, trying to reach her, to drag her back into the depths of the house. She reached the door, her hand slamming against it with desperate force. It wouldn't open. The handle twisted in her hand, but the door remained locked, as though it were resisting her every movement. She pulled harder, the wood creaking under the strain, but it wouldn't budge. You can't leave. The voices were almost deafening now. They were inside her head, inside her thoughts, and they laughed. They laughed at her, their voices echoing with a twisted, mocking tone that sent chills through her body. Sarah slammed her fists against the door, her vision swimming with panic. She could feel the shadows closing in, their cold tendrils creeping up her legs, her body, their touch like ice. You will never leave. The words echoed louder now, the walls shaking with the force of the voices, the very house itself alive with the sound of her terror. And then, something inside Sarah snapped. With a ferocious cry, she stepped back, her entire body trembling with raw fear and fury. She slammed her body into the door, using every last ounce of strength, her shoulder crashing into the wood with a sickening thud. The door exploded open. She fell forward, tumbling into the room beyond. The air was colder here, colder than anything she had felt before. It was like stepping into a tomb, the air thick and damp, filled with the smell of decay. She pushed herself to her feet, her heart racing in her chest as she looked around the room. It was different, completely different from the rest of the house. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the floor stained with something dark, the remnants of old furniture scattered haphazardly across the room. There was an overwhelming sense of neglect, of abandonment. And yet, there was something else here, something darker. Something waiting. A low, rumbling sound filled the air, like the groan of a building under strain. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble, the walls shifting, expanding, as though the room was growing, folding in on itself. Sarah turned toward the only source of light in the room, a single, flickering candle sitting atop an old, rotting table. And as the flame flickered, it illuminated something far worse than what she had imagined. At the far end of the room, standing in the corner, was a figure. Tall, cloaked in shadow. Its face was obscured, but its presence was undeniable. It was the same figure from before, the one from the mirrors. The one who had spoken to her, told her she could never leave. And this time, it was real. It was here, and it was waiting for her. The figure in the corner stood motionless, its form cloaked in shadow. Even as Sarah's heart pounded violently in her chest, her breath coming in sharp, desperate gasps, her feet refused to move. It was as if the figure was pulling her, holding her in place with some unseen force. The very air in the room felt thick, suffocating, as if the house itself was trying to wrap around her like a noose. Sarah's mind raced, but there was no escape. There was nowhere left to run. The figure shifted, just slightly, a whisper of movement that made Sarah's skin crawl. It was a small thing, but enough to make her freeze. The shadows around it seemed to pulse with life, swirling and twisting in a way that defied natural law. The room, once decayed and forgotten, now felt alive, as though it had been waiting for her, breathing with a rhythm that was not her own. It stepped forward. The floorboards creaked under its weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the otherwise still room. The figure was tall, far too tall, its frame thin and elongated, as if it had been stretched unnaturally. It wore a cloak of deep black that seemed to absorb the very light, blending into the darkness as though it were made of it. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. No, she thought. No, this can't be real. It can't be. But it was real. The figure was right in front of her now, and she could feel its presence pressing against her like a physical force. The shadows around it seemed to press inward, as if the room itself were folding around her, trapping her. It was everything she feared, everything that had been creeping in her mind from the moment she entered the house. And then it spoke. Its voice was soft, almost gentle, but it sent a chill through Sarah's entire body. "You've come far, Sarah," it said. Its tone was strange, as if it carried the weight of centuries, of things far older than anything Sarah could understand. "But you're too late." Sarah's throat constricted, the words sinking deep into her soul like poison. Her knees buckled slightly, but she forced herself to stay upright. She couldn't let it win. She had to fight. Too late. Sarah croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. She took a shaky step back, but the figure didn't move. "What do you mean? I didn't come here willingly." The figure raised a hand, its long, thin fingers stretching toward her, and a wave of darkness followed its motion. The air in the room thickened, and Sarah felt herself pushed back, her feet sliding across the floor as if she were trapped in a dream. "You don't understand," it said, its voice more insistent now, a low, terrifying whisper that vibrated through her skull. "You never understood. The house calls, and it takes. It always takes." Sarah struggled against the force pulling her forward, her hands trembling as she pressed them against the cold, damp wall. The words were a poison, swirling through her mind, telling her things she wasn't ready to hear, things she couldn't accept. But somehow, a small ember of defiance sparked within her. "No?" Sarah shouted, her voice growing stronger with each syllable. "I won't be part of this. I won't let you win." The figure's expression, if it could be called that, shifted, just slightly, as though it were amused. It tilted its head, the shadows around its face deepening, swallowing any trace of its features. "You already are part of this," it said, its voice thick with finality. "This house doesn't let go. It never has." Before Sarah could respond, the figure took another step toward her. The air around her seemed to warp, distort, and the shadows reached out like hands, wrapping around her, pulling her into the darkness. She gasped, her vision blurring, her body being drawn toward it. The coldness was unbearable, like ice seeping into her bones, numbing her. She couldn't breathe. The darkness was suffocating, crushing her. And then, just as she thought she couldn't fight anymore, something shifted. Something inside her snapped, her body trembled with an unholy rage, her fists clenching so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. She had no idea where the strength came from, but she pushed it forward, forcing her feet to move, forcing herself to resist the dark pull of the figure. She couldn't let it win. She wouldn't. With a scream that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house, Sarah lunged forward, slamming herself into the figure. The shadowy tendrils recoiled from her, as though repelled by her force. She felt a surge of power course through her, her body alive with something other than fear, something ancient, something raw, something that the house had never expected. For the briefest moment, the figure faltered. It hissed, the sound of it like the scraping of nails on glass, and the darkness around it recoiled. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. She wasn't sure what had happened, but something had changed. For the first time, she felt in control. No, the figure hissed, its voice tinged with something resembling fear. You cannot fight it. You belong to the house now. But Sarah didn't listen. She stepped forward again, her hands shaking but determined, and the figure retreated. It seemed to hesitate, its form flickering, losing its sharp edges as if it was struggling to maintain its shape, and then the walls trembled. The ground beneath her feet shook violently, as though something was shifting. Something was moving deep within the house. The flickering light above them intensified, casting everything in stark, flickering shadows. The house was alive again, and it was angry. A deep rumbling filled the air, vibrating through the walls and floor, as if the very heart of the house was waking, stirring. Sarah staggered back, her hand instinctively reaching for the nearest support as the shadows around her grew more frantic, more desperate. No one leaves, the figure rasped, the voice barely audible beneath the roar of the house. No one ever leaves. You can't. Suddenly, the house seemed to scream. A deafening, visceral wail filled the air, so loud and overpowering that Sarah felt as though it was ripping through her very soul. The shadows around her erupted, swirling violently as though the house itself was being torn apart from the inside. It was as though every mirror, every inch of this cursed place was alive, crying out in pain. Sarah dropped to her knees, clutching her head, her thoughts spiraling in every direction. The whispers from earlier rose up again, now a cacophony of voices, too many to count, all pleading, all screaming for release. The weight of their despair pressed down on her, crushing her will. But then she saw it. The mirror. It wasn't far, just across the room. Its surface rippled like water disturbed by a stone. There was something in it. Something that didn't belong. It was her. Her reflection, distorted and grotesque, was staring back at her. But this time, something was different. The reflection in the mirror moved as though it were alive. Its eyes locked onto hers, and it smiled, a twisted, mocking smile. It's your choice, Sarah. The reflection said, its voice a low, mocking tone. Join us, or become one of us. The decision was clear. She couldn't go back. She couldn't stay. She had to fight. With everything she had left, she lunged forward, toward the mirror. As she touched it, the house screamed in agony, and everything went black. Darkness enveloped Sarah completely, swallowing her whole. It was cold, bitter, the kind of cold that felt like it seeped into her very soul. She tried to scream, but the air was thick with a heaviness that stifled her voice. Her body felt weightless, as though she was floating, suspended in a void with no up or down, no direction at all. The longer she lingered in that inky abyss, the more her thoughts seemed to disintegrate, her sense of self fading as though it were being drawn into the nothingness. And then, without warning, the darkness lifted. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't soft. The void simply ended. Sarah's feet slammed against the cold, hard floor, the shock of it pulling her back to herself. She gasped, her breath rattling in her chest as she tried to catch her bearings. Her eyes blinked rapidly, adjusting to the dim light that flickered weakly in front of her. She was in the same room, but it wasn't the same room. Everything had changed. The walls were no longer decayed, no longer dripping with mildew and rot. Instead, they gleamed with a cold, sterile white light, casting harsh shadows across the space. The mirrors were gone, replaced by smooth, featureless panels that stretched across the room. The oppressive, claustrophobic atmosphere had evaporated, replaced with something that felt Too perfect, too clean, too artificial. She spun around, her head reeling, as her feet shuffled beneath her. It was as though the room had been scrubbed clean of all its history, its suffering. And yet, something about it felt wrong. The air still hummed with a low vibration, an undercurrent of something terrible just beneath the surface. "It's not real," she muttered under her breath, her voice trembling. "This isn't real." But it felt real. She could feel the floor beneath her feet, the weight of her own body, the cold air prickling against her skin. The lights above buzzed softly, flickering intermittently, as though they were struggling to stay on. "You've made your choice." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, wrapping itself around her like a shroud. It was soft, distant, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. The sound sent a shiver up her spine. Her head snapped toward the source of the voice. She couldn't see anyone, but she could feel it, the presence in the room with her. It was all around her, filling the space with a sense of foreboding. "Do you understand now, Sarah?" The voice continued, low and coaxing. "The house doesn't need mirrors to hold you." She turned in circles, her breath quickening, but she couldn't see where the voice was coming from. The walls around her seemed to ripple in the corner of her vision, distorting, twisting like liquid. She reached out a hand, but nothing was there, nothing solid. The air felt like it was slipping through her fingers. "The house feeds on fear," the voice whispered. "And now it feeds on you." Sarah's pulse quickened, terror flooding her veins. The words, they rang in her mind like a drumbeat. She could feel them, deep in her bones. The realization hit her like a freight train. She was still inside the house. She hadn't escaped. She had just entered another layer of it. One more place where the walls moved, the floors shifted, and the house could bend reality to its will. Her mind reeled, but a small, defiant voice inside her pushed back. She couldn't let it win. She had to fight. She had to hold on to the last shred of herself. She staggered forward, her body stiff, uncooperative, and found herself standing before a tall, narrow door at the far end of the room. It was different from the others. This door wasn't ordinary. It was old, weathered, its wood twisted and warped. The metal handle gleamed, cold and inviting, beckoning her. Without thinking, she reached out, her fingers brushing against the handle, and the door creaked open with a low, groaning sound. It didn't matter how many times she had opened doors in this cursed house. She always felt that same sense of dread when they opened, like stepping into the unknown. On the other side of the door was a hallway. But this hallway wasn't like the one she had seen before. This hallway seemed to stretch on forever, its walls lined with cracked portraits and flickering candle sconces. The air was colder now, the light dimmer, as though something ancient lingered in the corners, watching. "You will not leave," the voice echoed from the shadows. "Not until the house has taken everything from you." Her heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to back down. She was so close. There had to be an end to this madness. She pushed herself forward, determined, refusing to succumb to the house's twisted grip. Every step she took felt like it was pulling her deeper into its web, but she ignored the rising panic, ignoring the whispers in the back of her mind. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, and yet it was no longer just a physical space. It was a maze, a labyrinth of memories and twisted reflections. As she walked, the portraits on the walls shifted. Faces, familiar, distorted, stared at her with hollow eyes. She could see herself in the portraits, but each one was a different version, a different reflection of who she might have been. There was a young girl, a woman smiling, a shadowy figure reaching toward her. The images flickered, twisted, and in each one, Sarah could see the same thing, a version of herself that had already been consumed by the house. "They're all here," the voice whispered again, and this time there was an edge of hunger in it. "You're not the first to come seeking escape." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. No, no, she wouldn't let it consume her too. Not like this. She reached the end of the hallway, where the path split into 3 doors. One was sleek, almost modern in design, with glowing symbols carved into the wood. The second was a heavy, iron door, rusted and twisted, like something out of a forgotten dungeon. The third door was made of glass, reflecting her image back at her, but it flickered, like a fractured memory, one she couldn't fully grasp. The whispering voice was louder now, coming from all 3 doors at once. Choose. The choice was overwhelming. What did any of these doors lead to? The answers felt just out of reach, like wisps of smoke that escaped her grasp, no matter how desperately she tried to catch them. She stared at the doors, her mind racing. And then, the air shifted again. The glass door shimmered, and for just a split second, Sarah thought she saw something, or rather, someone, moving behind it. A figure, familiar, yet distorted, as though it had once been her. The figure's mouth opened, and in a voice that sent a shudder through her body, it spoke. You should have stayed. Everything inside her screamed for her to turn away, to choose one of the other doors, but she couldn't. The pull was too strong. The glass door felt like the right choice, like it was the door that had been waiting for her. With trembling hands, Sarah reached for the door. The glass cracked beneath her touch, the jagged edges cutting into her palm as she pushed it open. But she didn't feel pain. She stepped forward, and everything went black. Sarah's world was black. No sounds, no light, no feeling. Just the deafening silence and the pressure of something unseen, but there. She felt the weight of it, suffocating, wrapping around her like a vice. Her breath was shallow, and her heartbeat seemed to reverberate in her ears, thudding louder with every passing second. She had stepped through the glass door, but she didn't know where it had led her. It felt like she was falling, floating, or perhaps even sinking into something much darker than before. There was no up, no down, no sense of direction at all. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness receded. The world snapped back into place, and Sarah staggered forward, her feet colliding with solid ground. She caught herself against a stone wall, gasping for air as her mind struggled to make sense of what had just happened. When her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she looked around. She was in an ancient, underground chamber, cold, damp, and suffused with a low, flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere. The stone walls were jagged and uneven, covered in strange, indecipherable symbols, their edges worn by time. The air was heavy with the scent of mold and age, and the only sound was the faint drip of water somewhere deep in the shadows. It was like stepping into a forgotten tomb. For a moment, Sarah simply stood there, her mind racing. The house had brought her here. She could feel it. This place, this room, was part of it. She could sense it in the air, in the way everything around her felt alive, vibrating with a strange, terrible energy. The very walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of some unseen heart. You shouldn't have come here. The voice came from the shadows, its words crawling into her mind, curling around her thoughts like a serpent. The tone was cold, bitter, and yet familiar. It was the same voice that had been whispering to her for days now. The same voice that had tried to break her, tried to bend her will to the house's twisted desire. But this time, it was different. There was something more behind it, something deeper, more personal. She turned, her pulse quickening, and saw it. A figure stood in the center of the room. It was cloaked in darkness, its form barely visible against the backdrop of shadows. But even through the gloom, Sarah could see the outlines of the figure, a tall, slender shape, its limbs impossibly long and stretched. It was watching her with eyes that glowed faintly, pinpricks of light in the inky darkness. It was familiar. She knew it. The figure stepped forward, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat as recognition hit her like a ton of bricks. It was her. or at least a twisted version of her. The figure's face was contorted, its skin pale and stretched tight across its skull, and its eyes, those eyes, were the same hollow, lifeless pits that had appeared in the mirrors. But this time, they weren't reflecting her, they were her. It was like looking into a cracked mirror, one that had been shattered and reassembled in pieces. The figure, Sarah's reflection, smiled, though there was no warmth in it, just a cold, mocking grin that spread across its face like a dark promise. "You shouldn't have come," the reflection repeated, its voice a twisted version of Sarah's own. "You can never leave, we never do." Sarah's legs felt weak beneath her, but she refused to back away. She clenched her fists, summoning the last of her strength. She had come too far, fought too hard to let this thing take her. "No," Sarah said through gritted teeth. "I won't be like you." The reflection's grin only widened. "You already are." Suddenly, the world around Sarah shifted. The walls seemed to twist and bend, the stone moving like liquid, warping and collapsing inward. The floor began to crack beneath her feet, large fissures opening up as though the very earth was splitting in half. The chamber trembled violently, and a low, guttural rumbling filled the air, as if the house itself were waking, stirring, hungry. "You've made your choice," the reflection said, its voice now a terrible symphony of Sarah's own thoughts and fears, a mockery of her every emotion. "Now you belong to it. You belong to the house." The ground beneath Sarah's feet buckled, and before she could react, she was falling through the cracks in the floor. The darkness swallowed her whole, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she lost all sense of herself. But then everything stopped. The fall had ended. The darkness had vanished. Sarah gasped as she found herself standing on solid ground once more, though the air around her felt thin and cold. Her legs were unsteady, but she forced herself to stand tall. She had to keep going. She had to. Her thoughts were cut off by the sound of footsteps, heavy, unmistakable. She spun around, heart racing, and there, emerging from the shadows, was the figure again. But this time, there was no mistaking what it was. It was not just her reflection anymore. It was the house. The figure was the house itself, its twisted, demonic form woven into the shape of the reflection. It was made of darkness, of broken memories, of twisted versions of people who had come before. It was a grotesque amalgamation of all the things the house had devoured, all the lives it had stolen. And it was staring right at her. "You can't fight it," the figure said, its voice 1,000 voices, all distorted and garbled together. "You belong to it now. You always have." The words rang in Sarah's ears, and for a moment she felt her resolve start to crack. The house was powerful. It was ancient, insidious. It had broken everyone who had come before her. Could she really fight it? Could she escape? No, she couldn't let it win. Her mind raced, and then, like a spark igniting in the dark, she remembered. The mirrors. The house had used them against her, showing her twisted versions of herself. But now she realized something. The mirrors weren't just reflections. They were traps. They were gateways. The house used them to trap souls, to keep them locked in its clutches forever. But she had already broken the glass. She had already shattered its hold on her once. If she could break it again, break the cycle, she might still have a chance. The figure moved closer, its shadowy form rising up, pressing down on her like a physical weight. She could feel the coldness of it, the weight of its darkness seeping into her bones. "You cannot run," the figure hissed, its voice now a single, monstrous entity. "You cannot escape." But Sarah wasn't listening. She closed her eyes, her mind flashing back to that moment. The moment when she had broken through the mirror before. When she had fought. When she had refused to be consumed. With all the strength she had left, she raised her hand and reached out toward the reflection of herself. The twisted version that grinned back at her from the shadows. She wouldn't be like them. With a scream that ripped through the air, she shoved her hand forward, her fingers connecting with the cold glass of the distorted reflection. And everything shattered. The house screamed. The world exploded. The moment Sarah's fingers made contact with the twisted reflection, the air seemed to crack apart with a sound like the ripping of reality itself. It was not a normal crash, not the sound of glass breaking. No, this was something deeper, something far more violent. It felt like the earth itself was shaking, like the very fabric of the house was being torn apart at the seams. The figure, the twisted reflection, howled, a sound that scraped against Sarah's nerves. A terrible noise that seemed to rip through her soul. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, its body convulsing in a way that was not human. The walls around her cracked, the stone buckling and shifting like it was alive, the entire room beginning to collapse into itself. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and she had to steady herself against the stone, her heart racing. For a brief, terrifying second, Sarah thought she might be swallowed whole by the chaos, that the house itself would consume her before she could even understand what was happening. The air was thick with the weight of centuries of suffering, the echoes of countless souls who had been trapped, just like her, in the clutches of the house. But she refused to stop. With all her remaining strength, Sarah reached deeper inside herself, tapping into the energy she had drawn upon when she had fought the shadows before. She couldn't afford to be afraid. Not now. Not when she was this close to breaking free. Her hand slammed forward again, harder this time, as the distorted reflection writhed in the glass. The surface cracked, the fracture lines spreading outward, and with one final, shuddering scream, the reflection splintered into 1,000 pieces. The house groaned. It was as if the very foundation of the structure had been shattered, the walls shuddering in pain. And the air around her thickened with a palpable darkness. The ground beneath her feet cracked open, a deep chasm splitting the room, and from the depths, something ancient and terrible began to rise. But Sarah didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her eyes blazing with determination. This was the moment. The house had tried to break her, to twist her into something else, something lost. But she had fought back. She had shattered its hold over her, and she would not let it claim her now. The darkness around her swirled, and the house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as though it were breathing in the aftermath of the destruction. But beneath the crushing weight of the shadows, something else stirred. There was a crackling energy in the air, a sharp, electric hum that filled the room. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something new, something Sarah had awakened within herself. Something tied to the house's very heart. She felt the ground beneath her tremble again, but this time it wasn't the house fighting back. It was something else. A response. Something was being unlocked, something the house had tried to keep hidden, buried deep within its bowels. The air hummed with an ancient, forgotten power. In the distance, beyond the swirling chaos of the room, Sarah saw it. The heart of the house. It wasn't a literal heart, of course, but she could feel it, sense it, like a throbbing pulse deep in the earth, in the very core of the house. It was the source of everything: the shadows, the voices, the twisted reflections. Everything had come from this place, from the dark power that fueled the house's existence. The force that had been feeding on souls for centuries, trapping them in its endless cycle. And now, Sarah knew, it was time to end it. With each step she took toward the center of the room, the house seemed to grow weaker. The walls creaked and groaned as if they were protesting her every move. But Sarah didn't stop. She pushed forward, her eyes locked on the source of the power, the dark center of the house that called to her like a twisted magnet. Her body felt alive with energy, her heart beating with a force she hadn't known she was capable of. The whispers that had plagued her, those voices that had filled her thoughts, grew faint, distant, as if they were being drowned out by the growing hum of power within her. When she reached the center of the room, she saw it clearly, the source of the house's power. A mirror. But it wasn't like the others. This mirror was massive, its frame carved with intricate, almost alien symbols. The glass was dark, its surface swirling like oil, constantly shifting and changing. It was not a reflection, not a window into another world, but something much darker. Something that pulsed with the raw energy of the house itself. This was it, the heart of the house. Without hesitation, Sarah stepped forward, her hand reaching toward the mirror. It felt cold, colder than anything she had ever experienced, but she pushed past the chill. She had to do this. Her fingers grazed the glass, and instantly, the mirror reacted. The swirling darkness shifted, crackling like electricity. The ground beneath her feet rumbled, as though the very house was fighting to keep its heart hidden. The mirror's surface rippled, and Sarah could feel it. Feel the power that had kept the house alive, the force that had kept the souls trapped here for centuries. It was suffocating, but she had one final weapon: her mind. Sarah closed her eyes and reached deep inside herself. She could feel the house's energy thrumming through the air, but now, she realized, it wasn't just the house's power she was tapping into. She was connected to it, yes, but she was also disconnecting from it. She was severing the bond that had tied her to the house. With a fierce cry, Sarah shoved her hand harder into the glass, her body pulsing with every ounce of defiance she could muster. The mirror cracked beneath her touch, the darkness inside it shattering like glass. The house screamed. The walls buckled, the floors cracked open wide, and the entire structure began to collapse, the very foundation shaking, as though it were coming apart at the seams. The mirror shattered into a million pieces, and the room around her exploded with light. The last thing Sarah saw before everything went white was the reflection of herself, real, whole, free. And then the world disappeared. Silence. When Sarah's eyes opened again, the first thing she noticed was the light. It wasn't the flickering, dim light of the house, but a warm, golden glow. The air was fresh, clean, and she could hear birdsong, faint but clear. She was standing in a field. The world around her was peaceful, calm, untouched by the horrors she had endured. The sky was bright, the grass swaying gently in the breeze. She took a step forward and it felt real, it felt right. And then, in the distance, she saw it. A small figure walking toward her. It was a woman, her form familiar. As the figure drew closer, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was her mother. Her mother's warm smile greeted her, and as she reached out her hand, Sarah's chest tightened with an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in so long. Hope. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. The woman nodded, her smile soft and comforting. "You're free now, Sarah." The house had finally released its grip on her, and this time, Sarah was truly free. Sarah's chest swelled with a surge of emotion as she reached out to her mother. The woman's smile was like a beacon of warmth in this serene, peaceful place. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sarah felt safe. She felt free. The weight that had been pressing down on her, the suffocating grip of the house, had finally lifted. Her mind was clear, her heart unburdened. She had won. Her mother's hand reached out, and as their fingers touched, Sarah felt a warmth spread through her. The connection was immediate, natural, as though she had been waiting for this moment her whole life. "You did it," her mother's voice whispered, her tone soft and reassuring. "You're free, Sarah. The house is gone." Sarah felt the tears well up in her eyes, not from fear or despair, but from the immense relief that surged through her. She had been trapped in that house, in that nightmare, for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be at peace. I don't understand," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of the question. "How is this possible? I thought She glanced around at the peaceful, sunlit field, the open sky, the gentle breeze. I thought I was going to die there. I thought I was going to be lost forever. Her mother's smile softened, and she gently took Sarah's hand in both of hers. You were never truly lost. My love, the house feeds on fear, on pain. It tries to bend you, break you. But there's always a way to escape. You just have to remember who you are, what you're capable of. Sarah's heart ached at her mother's words. She hadn't realized it before, but the house had been more than a structure, more than just a series of rooms and mirrors. It was a force that had preyed on her darkest fears, had made her question herself, her reality. But her mother was right. The house fed on the broken, on the ones who couldn't find their way out. But Sarah had found it. She had fought. And she had broken free. She looked down at her hands, now trembling with exhaustion. But the tremors weren't from fear. No, they were from the sheer weight of the relief she felt. The house had finally been silenced, its grip broken. And yet, there was something she still couldn't shake. But, is it really over? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, as if she feared speaking too loudly might shatter this fragile peace. Her mother's smile wavered for the briefest of moments, a shadow crossing her expression, before she quickly masked it. Yes, it's over. The house is gone. You're free now. But Sarah saw the hesitation, the lingering doubt in her mother's eyes. She could feel it. Something was not right. The warmth of this place, the light, the peace, it felt too perfect, as if it were all a little too good to be true. What's wrong? Sarah asked, stepping back, her brow furrowed in concern. What do you mean? What aren't you telling me? Her mother's gaze flickered, and for the first time, Sarah saw the hesitation, the weight of something unspoken. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the peaceful atmosphere around them began to shift. The air grew heavier. The warmth of the sun seemed to fade, replaced by a strange chill that crept in from nowhere. The sky above began to darken, slowly at first, but then faster, like a storm rolling in. The breeze that had once been gentle turned sharp, biting at Sarah's skin. No, Sarah whispered, her heart sinking. Her mother stepped back, her smile now gone, replaced by a hollow look in her eyes. It's not over, Sarah. Suddenly, Sarah felt the ground beneath her feet tremble, as if something vast and ancient was waking up beneath the surface. The once soft grass beneath her feet hardened, the earth cracking open. The sky above darkened, and the sun that had bathed the field in warmth disappeared entirely. The serene world around her was beginning to unravel. What do you mean? Sarah cried, her voice rising in desperation. I don't understand. You said it was over. Her mother's figure began to fade, her once comforting presence now shifting like a mirage. She reached out a hand, but the image of her mother distorted, her features twisting, becoming something unrecognizable. No, Sarah gasped, stumbling backward, her eyes wide in horror. You were real. You were real? But now, her mother's face wasn't just fading. It was becoming something else. Her smile, once warm, was now twisted and grotesque. Her skin began to crack, revealing the raw, blackened flesh beneath. Her eyes, once soft and kind, were now empty, filled with a darkness that mirrored the house. Sarah. The figure croaked, its voice deep, hollow, and far colder than before. You never left. Not really. The world around Sarah shattered. The field, the sky, the warmth, everything fractured and crumbled like brittle glass. The world fell apart, and she was once again plunged into darkness. The ground beneath her feet dissolved, and she fell into the black abyss, her body weightless, floating through endless shadows. It's not over. The voice echoed, its haunting tone filling her ears. You can't escape. For what felt like an eternity, Sarah fell. The darkness enveloping her, pulling her under, until, just as it seemed like she would be consumed by it, there was a sudden burst of light. The light was blinding. It tore through the darkness, cutting it away like a blade. The cold, the suffocating grip of the house. It all disappeared, as though it had never been there at all. The light surrounded her, filling her with warmth, filling her with a sense of a home. Slowly, the darkness began to fade, and Sarah's body settled, her feet touching solid ground once more. She looked around, but the landscape had changed again. She was no longer in the peaceful field, nor the crumbling house. She was standing in a vast, empty space, the light surrounding her, but offering no clear direction. Sarah. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't her mother's. It wasn't anyone's. It was a deep, booming sound that reverberated through her entire being. A voice that felt ancient, timeless. "You think you've won," the voice said, "but this isn't the end. It's only the beginning." The light flickered, and in its shifting glow, Sarah saw something. A figure, vast and towering, standing before her. It was not human, not even close. Its form was a swirling mass of shadows and light, a creature made of both the night and the dawn. Its eyes, glowing with an ancient fire, fixed on her with a knowing gaze. And then, it spoke again, its voice like 1,000 whispers merging into one. "You will always return. The house will always call." And with that, the darkness began to close in once more. The light flickered and waned, and Sarah felt herself being pulled back into the endless abyss. But this time, she wasn't running. She was ready. The darkness swallowed Sarah whole once again. But this time, it didn't feel like falling. It didn't feel like the crushing weight of the unknown. Instead, it felt familiar. The abyss stretched on, but she wasn't afraid. She could feel it now. The pull, the presence of the house, deep in her bones. It was not a separate entity anymore. It was a part of her. It was a reflection of her fears, of her doubts, her regrets, her insecurities. The house was no longer just a place of torment. It was a manifestation of everything she had been trying to escape, trying to outrun. But she couldn't run anymore. As she sank deeper into the void, the presence that had been chasing her, the shadows, the echoes, the whispers, began to speak again. But this time, there was no fear, no terror in their words, only a strange, terrifying clarity. "You've always been a part of it, Sarah." Her feet touched solid ground, but the darkness didn't recede. It enveloped her like a thick fog, making it hard to breathe, hard to see. Yet, despite the suffocating gloom, Sarah felt an odd sense of calm. The weight that had crushed her in the house, those haunting, impossible moments, was no longer there. The house wasn't just a cage now. It was a part of her, as much a part of her soul as the memories she had carried her whole life. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't lost anymore. The house had always been here waiting for her to acknowledge it, waiting for her to accept it. "You never escaped," the voice whispered, the words slithering into her mind like poison. "You just ran. You always will. This is where you belong." Sarah gritted her teeth, shaking her head. The truth of those words scraped against her heart. It was true, in a way. She had been running from the house, from the memories it dredged up, from the pain it reminded her of. And now, she was back, but she wasn't the same. She had fought the house. She had fought the fear, the mirrors, the twisted reflections of herself. And now she could see it. The house was not invincible. It was not all powerful. It was a creation. It was her creation, born of everything she had buried deep inside. "No," Sarah whispered. "I'm not afraid anymore." Her words echoed in the void, but they didn't fade. They didn't disappear. Instead, they lingered in the air, vibrating with a power she had never known. The ground beneath her feet rumbled. The house was waking up again. The darkness around her grew denser, the shadows lengthening, but Sarah stood firm. The walls, the mirrors, she could feel them all, not as something to fear, but as part of the path she had walked. They had tried to break her. But now, she saw them for what they were, reflections. They were fragments of her, pieces of the story that she had been too afraid to face. She took a step forward. The house trembled. "You cannot leave." The voice from the shadows growled, its tone filled with an ancient rage. "You can never leave. It is your fate." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of that voice wash over her, but this time, it didn't scare her. It didn't have the same hold over her. She had lived through the house's torment. She had broken its cycle. Now, she understood something crucial. The house wasn't just the walls or the mirrors. It wasn't just the darkness. It was her mind, her memories, her fears. The house had no power over her unless she allowed it to. "I choose." The words came from her lips with a quiet certainty, and as soon as she spoke them, the room around her shifted. The darkness lifted. The walls that had once seemed so oppressive seemed to fall away like a crumbling facade. The house was breaking apart piece by piece, as though her choice had cracked its foundation. The shadows that had once plagued her were now retreating, fading like mist under the heat of the morning sun. And then the light came. It wasn't harsh. It wasn't blinding. It was soft, warm, and encompassing. The darkness had been a part of the house, yes, but so was the light. She could feel it swirling through her, wrapping around her like a blanket. The house, this dark, twisted thing that had held her captive for so long, was fading. The weight was lifting, the oppressive atmosphere being replaced by something new, something real. She opened her eyes. Before her stood the figure again, the one that had been her mother. But now, there was no darkness in her eyes, no hollow, empty smile. The figure was whole again. Sarah's mother was standing there, her expression soft and kind, the warmth in her eyes real. "You've done it," the figure said, her voice clear and full of love. "You've broken the cycle." Sarah felt her heart swell in her chest, a sense of relief flooding her, a sense of peace she had longed for. The house was gone, or at least, its hold over her had finally been severed. The weight of years of pain, of confusion, of fear had been lifted. She had fought her way free, and now she was standing in a place of clarity. She reached out and her mother's hand met hers, soft and warm. There was no darkness, no shadow between them anymore. "It's over," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Her mother nodded, her smile gentle. "Yes, for you. It's over." The world around them began to change. The space around them dissolved, not into the darkness, but into a new beginning. The light grew brighter, and Sarah realized she was no longer in the house. She wasn't even in the place she had been before, with the field and the sky. No, this place was something else entirely, something different. And as the light continued to surround her, Sarah took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling with each steadying inhalation. She wasn't running anymore. She had come to terms with it all, with the house, with herself. And now she could finally move forward, not haunted by the past, not bound by the fear that had once controlled her. "You're free now?" her mother said again, her voice filled with that same undeniable warmth. "You've broken the chains. You've made your own path." Sarah smiled. For the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't in what seemed like forever: hope. The house had tried to claim her, to twist her into something she wasn't. But Sarah had found her way. She had fought back. And now, she was free. And as she turned toward the light, she knew one thing for certain: the house could never take her again.